for her analysis, I spoke to Amy King. She's a senior lecturer at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU.
Anytime you liken a foreign government to Nazi Germany, that is immediately putting up a wall between your relationship with that country. And I think it's a very unfair comparison to make. Obviously, there are problems in some aspects of Chinese policy domestically and abroad, and those are things that the Australian government and other governments in the region are going to want to negotiate and work with China on. But China is simply not Nazi Germany, and I think it's a dangerous comparison to draw. I think it's also important for Australia to remember that other governments in our region would be very, very hesitant to draw a similar comparison and would see finding constructive ways to actually work with China, economically, politically, diplomatically, as a much more fruitful course to take. And we need to remember that many of the governments in our own region are not democratic, they're not authoritarian, and yet we need to work with these governments if we want to build the more sustainable, peaceful, prosperous, rules-based order.
In relation to this comparison, you said it's unfair. I guess those who would be of a similar view to Andrew Hastie would point out a couple of things. I guess the assertiveness of China's foreign policy in recent years in terms of the South China Sea particularly, but also internally the treatment of the Uyghur population. What would you say in response to that assessment, which in fact Andrew Hastie refers to specifically the creation, the reclamation of islands in the South China Sea as part of that example of the foreign policy?
Well, speaking first to the South China Sea issue, clearly it's an issue of concern. Many governments in the region are worried about the freedom of and the sustainability of open and free trade through those waters, remembering, of course, that much of that trade does go to China, of course, so it has an interest in protecting the openness of those waters as well. And there are many other claimants to that South China Sea dispute, which is why we want to see the dispute resolved peacefully. So yes, I think there is a reasonable concern about China's militarisation of the islands. I think it's also worth remembering, though, that China is acting from its own defensive posture here. It looks at the South China Sea and the wider Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region as a region in which the United States and its allies and partners continue to have the military edge. It's a region in which China feels, I think somewhat rightly, quite encircled by the US allies and partners. And I think this goes a long way to explaining the efforts it's taken in the South China Sea. It's an area that, as I said, is very critical to China's maritime security and its economic interests, but also in terms of its protection of its second strike nuclear capability, which is based on submarine facilities in the South China Sea. In the Xinjiang issue, it is an issue of great international concern, and I think Australia has done well to stand with other countries, both in the region and globally, to raise concerns about treatment of human rights, about them to the United Nations and other forums. And clearly we do have concerns about China's treatment of Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities. But ultimately, I think we need to also remember that these changes are unlikely to come through force. They're going to come through, probably most effectively, through quiet negotiations, through joined-up negotiations, working with other countries. And labels such as Nazi Germany make it very, very difficult for China's neighbours, for other countries in the region to stand alongside us and present a united front, if you like, in drawing criticism of China's behaviour on the Xinjiang issue in particular.
On one of the specific points that is also discussed by Andrew Hastie, I think the former Prime Minister John Howard touched on this as well earlier in the week when he spoke about the protesters in Hong Kong and basically this argument that the expectation that China would liberalise or democratise as its economy opened, but that's not the feeling of many observers now. In fact, that the authoritarian side of the regime has hardened in recent years, not softened or liberalised. What do you make of that broader argument about the need to see China in a different light, according to some of the analysis that is put forward, including that by Mr Hastie?
Look, I think clearly there is a sense of disappointment in the West. So much of US and other Western policy towards China was built on that bargain, if you like, that economic liberalisation and economic engagement might lead to greater democratic openness and less authoritarianism. That moved certainly in that direction, but there has been a turning back under the Xi Jinping government. What I would say, though, is that there are still very prominent voices in China looking for greater openness, and though Xi Jinping has retained a great deal of control, we would do well, I think, to try and support those voices, to support those in the economic community, those students and others, intellectuals, those in the government itself who are trying to reform China. It is a difficult country to reform. This is an enormous country that has had a very turbulent history. It's not going to be an easy reform process by any means. But I think taking the approach that sort of the view of the United States, particularly under the Trump administration, the view put forward by Andrew Hastie and others, that China is a wholesale threat, that we cannot do any business with China, is not a helpful strategy to take. It simply accelerates, it gives greater voice and impetus to those in China who would portray the world as one in which China is trying to be kept down, who would sort of call for stronger authoritarianism. Instead, I think we need to find areas where we actually can engage with China, where we can work productively with China. Because China is here to stay, ultimately. Whether we like the government or not, we do actually need to find areas where we can productively engage.
That's one of the things that I think has been seen as a point of difference between this particular rivalry and that of the Cold War, the fact that the economies of the two major powers are so intertwined, but that is at risk of unravelling given the trade war. How realistic is a deal now, or do you see it as almost impossible given how it's spiralled in recent weeks?
Look, I think it's getting harder and harder to see the possibility of a deal being reached, certainly before the US 2020 elections. Look, I might be proved wrong, obviously, but the conditions in either country at the moment and the most recent breakdown in talks, the initiation of new tariffs by the United States, makes it very difficult, I think, to see any incentives for China to find areas for cooperation with the United States. And it's worth remembering that I think, when we started this process, when the trade dispute was initially launched, the Chinese side was willing to come to the table. They were very moderate in their responses. They were very careful not to escalate the trade dispute. Their propaganda machine was very careful not to overly criticise the United States. But that has changed fairly dramatically in the last few months since the US has repeatedly issued further rounds of tariffs on Chinese imports and has blocked major Chinese firms like Huawei from doing business with the United States. So now you're seeing very serious commentators in China pointing out the fact that it's very difficult for China to be operating from a position in which it sees any good deal being reached. There are very few incentives, I think, now on the Chinese side to actually deal with the United States as a credible negotiator.
Amy King, Senior Lecturer at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU. Thanks for your insights, as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you.